The super summer rides off into the sunset. Hi, I'm Joe, and welcome to Same Name, Different Game. It's the end of the super summer. Yes, we have spent this entire summer talking about the SNES and things related to it in honor of that system's 25th birthday, and now we are finally going to talk about the thing that everybody seems to want to hear about the most, the 16-bit console war. So sit back and get ready for a little history. A refresher. The Sega Genesis hit Japan in October of 1988 and the US in August of 1989, getting a full 2-year head start on the Super NES. Despite little third-party support out of the gate, the system managed to garner solid sales in North America on the basis of an aggressive marketing campaign. It compared the 16-bit machine with the original NES. This was coupled with first-party games pouring out of Sega's various teams at what you might consider to be their absolute peak. And if you want to hear more about that, check out The Summer of Sega, a 3-part series we did on this show 2 summers ago in celebration of that system's 25th birthday. By 1991, when the Super NES launched, the Genesis was well entrenched, and the 16-bit era was a full-blown war in North America. Nintendo initially answered Sega's marketing by trying to be the better company, not stooping to attacks or controversy, and keeping violent games off of their platforms. This all hit a boiling point in 1993 when Senate hearings over Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and other games were at the center of an American controversy. And Howard Lincoln, then president of Nintendo of America, basically called Sega a pack of wolves with no scruples who were ruining America's children for no reason other than to line their own filthy pockets.
Only manufacturers acting responsibly can do that by controlling game content and keeping outrageous games like Night Trap off the market.
Now, as time went on, Nintendo had no choice but to relent, seeing their numbers slip against Sega's. And they did allow more violent and mature games on their consoles. But let's back up a bit. Nintendo infamously set massive restrictions on third-party publishers during the NES era. This is what led to Sega having to rely mostly on themselves and a very few select third parties like Electronic Arts, who decided not to throw in with Nintendo because the agreements were too restrictive. But several third parties like Konami and Capcom, they played ball with Nintendo. It wasn't until a Federal Trade Commission probe was launched into Nintendo's business practices, spurred on in part by an unfair competition suit from Atari, that Nintendo relented on this. In April of 1992, Nintendo removed substantial language from their third-party license agreement terms and opened up the market considerably. In the NES era, Konami was Nintendo of America's favorite son. You see, in those days, the publisher agreements meant that you could only release 5 games per year in North America, but Nintendo let Konami set up a separate label, Ultra Games, effectively upping their number to 10. Nintendo only let 2 publishers get away with this, Konami and Acclaim. But as of 1992, Konami was free to support Sega as well, and support they did, releasing their first 2 Genesis games that very same year, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist, And our game for this episode, Sunset Riders. Sunset Riders is a Wild West themed run and gun shooter that was initially released by Konami in the arcades in 1991. The game features 4-player support as the titular riders hunt down 8 bounties to make the West safer and to fatten their own pockets. Core gameplay is more similar to Rolling Thunder or Shinobi than Konami's own well-known Contra series, with most stages having 2 levels the riders can jump between. Weapons are also more limited than in the Contra series, with 2 characters using shotguns and 2 using revolvers, both of which can be powered up with a double shot and rapid fire. But this is good, in that choosing a character determines how you'll play the game in many ways. It's got a rockin' soundtrack from the Konami Kukeiha Club, fast-paced action, wonderful and creative boss encounters, and some fun set pieces. While it's not on the level of some entries in Konami's more famous series, which is arguably the peak of side-scrolling run-and-gun, it's still a blast, especially with 4 players, something a Contra game never had. While it may seem odd in this day and age, many a playground argument in those days was settled by whether the Super Nintendo or Genesis had the better arcade port. The closer to arcade perfect a game was, the bigger a feather that was in the cap of its respective console. So with that in mind, how does the Genesis port of Sunset Riders hold up? If we're talking about as a direct arcade conversion, not that great. It has the same core gameplay, but the stages are completely redesigned, going so far as to cut out 4 of the bosses. It also cuts out 2 of the heroes, so half of the heroes and half of the bosses are removed. The stage locations are mostly the same, at least for the stages that are still here, but most of the interesting parts and bosses are cut. All the stages where you ride horses? Cut. Most of the hilarious voice samples? Cut.
Marry me with my money.
Several of the best boss fights. Cut. One boss, Paco Loco, is even moved out of his stage, which was cut from this port, to a different stage, while the original boss of that stage, El Greco, is, you guessed it, cut. Furthermore, the removal of 2 of the heroes means that if you play 2 players, one player has to choose Billy, who uses the revolver, and one player has to choose Cormano, who uses the shotgun. This could cause some disputes when playing 2 players. The Genesis version also replaces the shooting gallery bonus stages with bonus stages where you ride your horse and catch items from the back of a wagon. This is pretty frustrating considering the normal stages where you ride are, again, cut from the game. It does have one nice addition in the inclusion of 2 fire buttons. One makes you stand still and shoot, and the other allows you to run and shoot. This is really valuable in some spots, and neither the arcade nor the Super NES have this feature. Overall, Sunset Riders on the Genesis isn't a bad port, but it is a far cry from the arcade original. Now, the following year in 1993, Konami also released a port for the Super NES. How does this one stack up? Now this is a port of Sunset Riders. The intro is taken straight from the arcade game, which the Genesis version lacks. All 4 characters are here, all 8 bosses are here, the soundtrack is much closer to the arcade game, and the voice samples are mostly intact. It doesn't support 4 players, and the stages aren't exact copies. I mean, just look here at the Chief stage. Now, in the arcade, there's this elevator segment, but it's not in the SNES port. The stages are much closer than what the Genesis approximates, and the inclusion of all 4 characters means that when playing 2 players, both of you can use the revolver, or both of you can use the shotgun. Still, there are some changes here from the arcade in other areas. First of all, if you lose all your lives in the single player in this version, it sends you all the way back to the beginning of the stage, while the Genesis port lets you pick up right where you died, just like in the arcade. Also, as I said earlier, until after 1993, Nintendo of America was pretty conservative, so the Ladies of the Night that you get power-ups from seem to have been changed to, I don't know, school marms? That's a Western trope, right? But this isn't the case in the Genesis version. The dancing girls in Stage 4 are also changed to be more conservatively dressed than the arcade version, but the stage with them is completely removed from the Genesis port, and that's even worse since, forget about the dancing girls, this is one of the best boss fights in the game. In a move that may not have been that bad, Native American enemies in the Chief stage have been swapped out for regular bandits. Also, the Chief's name is changed from Chief Scalpum in the arcade and Genesis versions to Chief Wigwam in the Super NES version, and I'm not really sure why that change was made because it's not as if Chief Wigwam isn't offensive. And both home ports remove the female enemies who toss dynamite at players in the arcade. Finally, there are some animations that are changed in both home ports. The Super NES game removes both the burning and the flattening animations, while the Genesis retains them. The Genesis, on the other hand, removes the silly running animation when you're on the bulls' backs, but the Super NES retains it. Both remove the drinking animation that sometimes plays when you enter a building for a power-up in the arcade original. It also merits mentioning that the ending is pretty truncated in both ports, but the Super NES has the lamest ending. It's just a single screen that says, "Congratulations, good job, podner." Not partner. Not even partner. Podner. Podner. But, anyways, let's go ahead and, like we do, take a look and a listen to all three of these versions, side by side by side. It's pretty clear that the Super NES is a lot closer to the arcade in both audio and visual terms, but given the smaller color palette of the Genesis, that version doesn't look terrible. Still, the arcade is clearly tops in both arenas. That makes it time to give the edge. It's certainly the arcade original, but if you're talking ports, definitely the Super Nintendo version is the better port. And that was often the case. Typically, the Super NES did the better arcade ports than the Genesis. But not always. Longtime viewers of this show will know that the Genesis version of Captain America and the Avengers is far superior to the Super NES port. By the same token, Mortal Kombat is much better on the Genesis than the Super NES, and not just because of the blood. Now, the great tragedy with this game is that while both ports are good, and the Genesis version is good in its own right, if you like the setting or the genre, you should definitely check it out. But none of these have seen any kind of re-release. The arcade original was rumored to be coming to Microsoft's Game Room service for the Xbox 360 shortly before that service was discontinued. Neither the Genesis nor Super NES port has hit the Virtual Console or any other similar service, which means the carts are astronomically expensive. The Super Nintendo version for just a cartridge is going to be about $100. The Genesis version is going to be half that, but neither of them honestly are really worth that price, and if you're going to emulate anyways, why not get 3 friends and go for the original experience? So that does it for Sunset Riders. But before we're done, whatever happened in that whole console war anyways? The Genesis tanked in Japan. It was outsold not only by the Super Famicom, but also by the PC Engine, the Japanese TurboGrafx. But it met with the most success here in the United States, going toe-to-toe with the SNES until the bitter end. While, yes, worldwide the Super Nintendo outsold the Sega Genesis by about 20 million units, in North America the race ended much more evenly, thanks in large part to the leadership of Sega of America. First Michael Katz, then Tom Kalinske. According to a 1998 New York Times article, the Genesis sold over 20 million units in the United States alone. That's 2/3 of its total unit sales. And according to Nintendo's own data, which you can find on their website, they sold 23.3 million Super Nintendo units in the Americas. The irony is that both Nintendo and Sega stumbled out of the gate in the generation that followed, with the N64 and the Saturn respectively, and they allowed Sony to swoop in and change the gaming landscape forever. With the PlayStation generation, games became much more widely consumed and accepted. It's arguable that the last time gaming was a niche hobby was the 16-bit era. After all, the PS1 sold more units than the Genesis and Super Nintendo combined. And while Sega wasn't able to adapt to the wide audience, Nintendo was. The Saturn started a downward trend Sega would never recover from in any region, leading to them becoming a third-party publisher following the failure of the Dreamcast. A wonderful system that I loved, but honestly it was just too little, too late for the mass audiences. Fortunately, Nintendo would make their way back, buoyed in large part by their portable systems during the bleak N64 and GameCube years, and they'd go on to meet incredible successes with the Wii and DS. If history has taught me anything, it's never count out Nintendo. And while they've gone on to have many more successes, it's the opinion of a great number of game players that they will never have as great of a library as the Super NES. So happy birthday, Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Let's hope that in 25 more years, people are still discovering and enjoying this wonderful, massive library of games. I'm Joe. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time, right here on Same Name, Different Game.
I think it's every parent's dream, maybe, to have a doctor in the family.